This is Vicky's Revenge, and I had no idea what was happening. Did my previous video make you curious about the revenge that Vicky would have in store for me? It took a few months for it to be revealed, but it had a lasting effect on my life in Indonesia. Hi, I'm Kate, and this is my YouTube channel that I call Kate Gypsy, the handle I've used online for years, and it fits my lifestyle. Well, let me remind you a little bit about the situation. It was the early 1980s, and I worked at an American company in Jakarta that employed both Americans and Indonesians. The main character in this story is Vicky, the Indonesian receptionist at the company where I was working. She had her eyes set on Jim, the American who did the company's photography work. Their nationalities normally wouldn't be important, but the fact that Vicky was Indonesian demonstrated how my lack of understanding of Indonesian culture got me into hot water. Being an expat involves a lot of adjustments, different norms, different traditions. Things can be really confusing. For example, in Indonesia, you may find that your dinner guests arrive 1 hour or more late, and no apology offered. Or you might find that children don't sit in a high chair to eat. Instead, they run around outside and are followed by someone who sticks a spoonful of food into their mouth whenever the child stops for a brief moment. And here's a difference that I found particularly annoying. A person asks you the same question over and over and over, even though you responded the first time, the second time, and every other time with the same answer. And what if you go to someone's home and you mention how much you like a particular knickknack or other item, maybe, and then you're gifted that item when you leave? You probably decide to be more careful about making compliments the next time you visit someone. These examples are just a few of the many, very many things I encountered here in Indonesia. And even though I've been here more than 40 years now, sometimes I still face situations that confuse me. So you can imagine that I certainly had a lot to learn in order to understand some of the subtleties of speech, glances, and so on. On the whole, my experience has shown me that Indonesians generally forgive a foreigner who seems like a proverbial bull in a china shop. But not Vicky. Nope. And she was going to give me quite a lesson. But before that, let me describe Vicky a little bit. Like most Indonesians, both her hair and her eyes were dark brown. Lots of Indonesian women are really beautiful. You've probably seen photos of beautiful Indonesian women, even though you might not have known they were Indonesian. Well, Vicky definitely didn't fall into that category. She looked okay, but she certainly wouldn't win any beauty contests. There were some things about her, though, that would make her stand out in a crowd. In fact, I've given Vicky a nickname, Vicky's of Hollywood. Are you old enough to remember Fredericks of Hollywood and the style that company promoted? You can see their products on the screen right now. Keep that in mind as we go on. They were well known for their sexy lingerie. Well, I never saw any of Vicky's lingerie, so I can't say anything about that. But as I recall, their bras back in the 50s made ladies' bosoms extremely pointed. I don't know how any man got close enough to kiss one of those ladies, without getting stabbed. Vicky somehow found similar bras in Indonesia, and they turned her breasts into lethal weapons. She didn't wear revealing clothing, but just because her blouses covered her whole chest and upper arms didn't mean that she couldn't stab you if you got too close to her. She was stuck in the 1950s in another way as well. She always wore skirts with multiple crinoline petticoats underneath. I knew what was underneath her skirts because I had dressed like that back in the 50s myself. The more petticoats you wore, the further your skirt flared out dramatically, and the higher your status as a fashion statement. But this wasn't the 1950s any longer. Vicky somehow thought she was in American high style, but that style had gone out of fashion years earlier. Now, it's only right that I should also include some mention of the strange notions Indonesians often had about Americans. At least in the early 1980s they did. Indonesia at that time had largely escaped westernization. The only Western fast food chains were Kentucky Fried Chicken and A&W. McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, they hadn't appeared yet. Although some Indonesians went to universities in the States and came back with realistic ideas about Americans, the majority were getting their impressions of Americans from unreliable sources, mainly movies and TV. Cowboy and gangster movies convinced them that, well, we all carried guns every time we left the house. Unfortunately, that might be coming true today. But in the 1980s, I didn't know anyone who had a gun. And television shows like Dallas gave Indonesians the idea that, well, everyone was sleeping with everyone else. So it wasn't unreasonable for Indonesians to have strange ideas about the average American. And Vicky's idea of American fashion just hadn't caught up yet. So let me move on to how Vicky decided to deal with me. When you learn what comes next, you might think, well, the same thing could have happened in the US. And you'd probably be right. But in the US, I probably would have been able to read the signs better. And I would have been better able to deal with the situation on my own. Just to remind you, my earlier video described the adventure I had in getting to Jim's apartment on my own in a huge city I wasn't familiar with yet. It ended up being a very positive experience when Indonesians came to my rescue. That video also mentioned that Vicky had arrived at Jim's place the next morning only to find out from the building watchman that Jim had come home with a blonde and she hadn't left yet. Neither Jim nor I found out about Vicky's visit until months later. The relationship between Jim and me was a total non-starter. Vicky was welcome to him as far as I was concerned, but she didn't know that. So she set about planning her revenge, trying to get me fired. But I knew nothing what was going to happen, so I went on my merry way. And actually, nothing unusual did happen for a week or two. Every day, the employees on my shift and I input text onto the floppy disks and left those disks for the earlier shift to proofread the next morning. Then they would pass them on to the people in charge of putting all the text into the correct format for the English language materials they were preparing for the client. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? And it was. The system worked well until One day I came in at 2 p.m. as usual. My boss, I'll call her Jennifer, was waiting to talk to me and asked why my floppy disk was full of garble. Well, I was the fastest typist on my shift, so that was a huge amount of work that had been lost. After examining the disk and trying to figure out what could have happened, I agreed with Jennifer that, well, the disk must have been corrupted. But that didn't really sound right to me. That would have been obvious when I went to save my work. It would have failed when I tried to save. But what else could I say? I had no other explanation. The garbled disk problem started happening fairly regular. 2 or 3 times each week, all the work I'd done on my most recent 8-hour shift was messed up. But the work by the employees was fine. I knew I was good at my job, and I became livid. I couldn't stand feeling so utterly helpless. What was really going on with these floppy disks? I had no idea. There were no clues for me to follow, so there was no possible way to understand what was actually happening to my work product. But I was sure Jennifer thought that I was a total incompetent. She didn't say that, but what else could she think? Yes, I was really good at this kind of work, and I had a series of positive reviews to prove it. But every day, I felt like a blind woman, trying to find her way until I found out whether my previous day's work was good or garbled. My original 3-month work contract was supposed to finish on the same ending date as everyone else's. When that date came around, negotiations for a continuing contract with the client were in process, but not completed. Since everyone expected negotiations to be successful, we were all extended a month to continue working as usual. But during that month, the SHIT hit the fan. Jennifer had been investigating the mystery of the garbled disks. She wasn't convinced that I was totally incompetent, and I was happy to find that out. Without my knowing it, she had questioned the employees on both shifts several times, and eventually the truth came out. Here are the results of her investigation. Vicky had gotten her friend Dia a job at this company. Dia worked on the early shift. In typical Indonesian fashion at that time, Dia had to pay 10% of her salary to Vicky every payday. Because Dia was indebted to Vicky for getting her a job, she also had to do whatever Vicky told her to do. And Vicky had instructed Dia to mess with my floppy disks every few days. So Dia came in early every few days and messed with the work I'd done. But guilt was eating away at Dia, and eventually she couldn't hold it in any longer. She overcame her feelings of obligation to Vicky and finally confessed everything. I don't know what happened to Vicky. She probably kept her job. In those days, everything was based on your contacts. And I'd heard that Vicky's family had some very important connections. I, on the other hand, was thrilled that I'd been vindicated. Everyone finally knew that I'd been framed and wasn't doing a lousy job. I thought that only happened in the movies, right? Of all the things that went through my mind during that time, I never thought that anyone was actually so angry with me that she would sabotage my work. And during all that time, Vicky hadn't shown even the slightest animosity toward me. That's very Indonesian, and I'll explain that in a future video. She wasn't friendly to me, but she was always polite. In the end, I was sick of the whole mess. Yes, they'd finally finished negotiations for the new annual contract, and they asked me to stay. I didn't want that kind of drama in my life, and I said, no way. You might have thought that this situation would have soured me on Indonesia and sent me right back to the US. But for some reason, it didn't. I'm not sure exactly why not. I think I'll examine that in a future video as well. But in any case, it definitely soured me on working for that company. So what would I do next? I had no idea, but I was optimistic. I was sure I could find another job in Jakarta. I wonder, though, how my life would have been different if I'd accepted the offer to stay there at that company. Would Vicky and I have gotten over our bad blood? And maybe we would have become fast friends. Or would I have always been suspicious of what she might do next? I'll never know, and I really don't care. What I did know is that I still had more lessons to learn. Please leave a comment below. Would you have left Indonesia at that point? Would you ever have come to Indonesia in the first place? I'd love to hear from you. And please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Every time you like my videos, you help me reach the goals I need in order to join YouTube's partner program. That's when they start sharing the money they make on ads in videos. I can't get there without you, so thanks in advance. And more videos about expat life in my adopted home of Indonesia coming soon. Bye-bye.